Good afternoon, everybody. As a speaker, I know from prior experience that the best possible speaking slot, when the audience and the speaker are really on and awake, is right after lunch. Right after lunch. So I do see a lot of people in the back, a couple people with their heads down. That's okay. A little nap time isn't going to hurt anybody. But I'm going to try and keep it interesting and compelling, and maybe most importantly for Jake and the rest of the RVAsec team to keep us on schedule. So I'm going to try and wrap up. We're a couple minutes into it already, around 1:50 this afternoon. Okay. My friend Charlie, there was an important piece of equipment that was up here, my slide forwarder. I wonder if maybe you removed that from the podium. No. Okay. Let me just make sure that I'm not going crazy up here. Not in my pocket. Let me ask you, Charlie, to just connect with Andy to see maybe if he picked it up. There was a slide shoulder. Andy is shaking his head. So if it magically appears, guys, maybe you could bring it up here. Otherwise, I'll just be a little more tethered than I normally am, which is okay. So we're going to be talking today about measuring security. This is kind of an agnostic presentation to talk about how do you think about measuring security inside your own environment. There's some good ways to do it. There are some less good ways to do it. And in terms of an overall agenda, really kind of 5 main topics that I want to start with. I'm going to give you probably the most obvious slide. Why are we interested in measuring anything? It was on the floor. This is why we have Charlie. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you. Now I can wander. Very important. Why do we measure anything? I'm going to give you some examples of maybe some poor metrics. I'm going to give you some examples of the importance of knowing your audience. So this is kind of the less technical portion of the talk, but it's an essential point. When I talk to customers who are kind of struggling with the security and the business folks not communicating with each other, knowing your audience is a very important, essential ingredient. I'm going to give you some examples of some good metrics that I've seen, and then we're going to close out with kind of a summary and some additional resources. I have tried to source almost all of the slides that I'm going to be showing you today. For the folks on this side of the room, you've probably got a pretty good view. You can at least see there's something happening in the lower left-hand corner of this slide. There might be a hyperlink, as there is on this slide. There might be just a reference maybe to an analyst report, which may or may not be publicly available. But all of these slides are obviously going to be available and published by RVAsec at the end. So whenever you see something in the lower left-hand corner, that is a sign that if you want, there's some additional reading that is available. So let me start with maybe one of the 2 provocative statements that I'm going to make to you over the next 45 minutes. And that is, while I did manage to drive down yesterday from DC, I packed my magic crystal ball, which foretells the future. I don't bring it on all my trips. The first provocative statement is, eventually the insurance industry will subsume the computer security industry. Now, that's not a Ben Smith quote, that's actually a Bruce Schneier quote. It's a Bruce Schneier quote from almost 15 years ago. The rest of his quote is in the bullet that's flown out here. He's really not talking about insurance companies getting in and competing with the RSAs and the other security vendors of the world. He's really talking about the essential truth and the reality, which is once insurance starts to come into the picture, regardless of the industry that you're in, and starts to touch the business, insurance begins to dictate rules. Insurance begins to dictate rules. So I am certainly seeing, maybe you are seeing as well at your companies and your organizations today, if you are doing any research in the cyber insurance space, Inga's got a great session kind of around insurance right after mine this afternoon, so I would encourage you to stay tuned for that. What I love about the quote is not just it's accurate, but it's actually 15 years old. So one of the reasons that this deck exists is if you have a better understanding of your own environment, and specifically the metrics inside your internal environment, the goal is to get you ahead of the curve. So that not if, but when insurance starts to dictate rules to you and your organization, you're going to be prepared to deal with that. So why do we bother measuring things? This is true not just for security, but for just about anything else that you might have in your environment. We're obviously interested in obtaining insight, what's happening inside the business. We want to underscore, to speak to the business in its own language. This is one of the tough nuts to crack that I talked about. I've got some more content on this in a few minutes. The ultimate goal as a security professional is to try and not just protect the business, but to try and demonstrate that the security program is continuing to bring value to the business. No one has unlimited budget. Unless you want to raise your hand and tell this vendor that you have unlimited budget, I'd be happy to talk to you. I haven't yet found that customer who has unlimited budget. It's very important for the security program to demonstrate that there is value to what it's doing. You want to try and this is a huge word, objectively demonstrate that whatever the security objectives are in your organization are indeed being met. Good metrics are going to kind of help you justify new investments so that when you go back to your CEO next year and you're asking for another 10%, 15%, if you have the right metrics, those numbers can help you get a different budgetary answer for next year. And then hopefully you're not just reporting on metrics, you're using these numbers to actually improve. So you've learned something from what you've taken in your environment, you've taken action against those numbers, and you're improving the security posture of your organization. Some examples of some poor metrics, and I've had this conversation with a lot of customers, repeatedly in some cases. Poor metrics tend to have one common thread, and it's this very first bullet. They tend to be very easy to collect, but they don't tend to be very actionable. Easy to collect, but they tend not to be very actionable. By far, the number one place where I have customers and colleagues who have kind of fallen off the bus in terms of poorly communicating metrics up to their management chain is maybe you're that guy or gal in IT who's had a very successful operationally focused role. You're accustomed to reporting on firewall drops and AV alerts, etc. Those are appropriate for a certain level in the organization. But if you've been super successful at your job and you've been promoted, congratulations, maybe you're a manager or director, maybe ultimately at the VP or even higher, the language, the vernacular that you need to use has to change by default. So things that are not a good idea necessarily to communicate at that level are things that are easy to collect but not very actionable. How many spam emails we received? How many virus infection attempts have we seen? Vulns resolved, failed logins. The bottom line is we tend to measure, we vendors and we organizations tend to measure the things that we can't control. Gartner had a great piece of collateral about 9 years ago, and I've reproduced this one graphic from it. For those of you on this side of the room, there's a reference in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. They put up this graphic, which has, it's a pretty graphic, first and foremost. It's got information about dropped packets, detected intrusions, and viruses detected. Gartner 9 years ago held this up as an example of what not to report on. Very easy to pull all this information out of your environment. Important operationally, but not necessarily something that's going to translate well at the C-level if you come in with a chart like this and try and justify your particular department. Those metrics tend to be subjectively measured. Poor metrics tend to be subjectively measured. They're not going to be measured the same way each time. You want to try and have a standard approach so that the way you measured it yesterday is the same way you're going to measure it tomorrow. So that you have objectivity, you have consistency. Poor metrics tend to be costly to gather, and this is not costly necessarily in terms of dollars. This is really costly in terms of time. This is code speak, guys, for you want to try and automate the generation of as many of these metrics as you can. I have had conversations with customers who said, we've got a great set of metrics that we owe up to the business once every 2 weeks. And I said, great, and they showed them to me, and they looked kind of interesting. And I said, how long does it take you to actually generate these? Because there was a lot of stuff I didn't recognize as being automatable. And they were honest with me. They said, yeah, it actually takes about 15 days to run this 2-week report. So they were chronically 2 weeks behind, plus somebody or some team was spending an immense amount of time putting together this report, which may or may not have been the best use of that team's time. So that's what I mean when I say poor metrics tend to be costly to gather. They might not even be metrics at all. I had one conversation with a customer who produced kind of a checklist where the answers were yes and no, and yes and no. And they said, these are the metrics that we are measuring or following in our environment. It wasn't really a list of metrics, though. It was almost like an auditing checklist. Are you compliant with this? Are you compliant with that? So my red light starts to flash when I'm talking to somebody and they've got a series of binary yes or no questions. Those may not actually be metrics. You might think they're metrics. Maybe your management thinks they're metrics, but my experience has been they typically are not true metrics if they're binary. And then maybe the most important point on this slide is this last bullet. Poor metrics may not be built for your true audience. Poor metrics may not be built for your true audience. So let's talk about the importance of knowing your audience. Cartoon that I've just put up here has somebody sitting behind a desk. She's spent a lot of time on a report. She's handed it off to the guy in the tie, and he's come back and he said, good start, needs more gibberish. Whether we've had this conversation with our boss or not, you probably have had that conversation, or you've had that where you put in a lot of time around something that you thought was going to be meaningful, and then the next level up didn't necessarily agree or at least understand that that was the case. The reality is, a big part of our job as security and risk management professionals is to try and create that common language between the capital B business and the capital S security. So as I'm positioning this here, I'm talking about maybe two different groups, and this has been the classic model in a lot of organizations. CISOs really should be the most influential security players and consultants to the business, but sometimes they're not. Especially if you are a CISO today, or maybe a CISO 3 years, 5 years, 8 years from now, who have come up from the IT side. Maybe you're still a little too focused on the operational measurements, and you haven't figured out how to kind of change your language. Those metrics, as you might guess, really have to kind of reflect the role and the value that the security organization plays, because the language of security is tough for the business to understand. So it's kind of presentation 101. One of the things I encourage customers to do when they are having these either board level or other senior level conversations inside their own companies is you got to practice. Don't just show up with the piece of paper or the PowerPoint deck with your metrics. Take some time. If you've been given 5 minutes in front of your board, or 10 minutes or 15 minutes in front of your board, please don't just get in there and wing it. Please don't just get in there and read off of a prepared statement. Work it out with a peer or a colleague and practice, because that's very, very important. Communicating in a business context. We heard Wendy earlier today talk about using templates in terms of some of the threat intelligence sharing best practices that she mentioned. Templates can be very useful here as well. Maybe you are fortunate/unfortunate enough to be in a large enough organization where there are standard templates for communicating certain types of information. Why reinvent the wheel? If there's a template that the business understands and that the business is already consuming, maybe that's your job as the security expert to leverage that same template. It might even make your job or your life a little easier. One would hope, anyway. Consider a taxonomy document. And by this, I mean it could be a full document. It could be like a legend on a map. There might be certain key terms that this month, as part of the metrics that I'm delivering, I'd like to define what an incident really is versus an event in my environment. Maybe use it as an educational opportunity, but provide those definitions, because just because we understand the distinction between those terms doesn't necessarily mean that the audience, right, and we want to always be thinking about the audience that we're presenting these metrics to, may or may not understand that. The business leaders, at least the ones that I've worked with, tend to be a little too busy, right? So a lot of the challenge that we have as security professionals is we've got to be able to connect the message we are trying to bring to an identifiable business driver. There's some homework involved, in other words. As you get higher up in the organization, the more successful CISOs or CISOs-to-be that I've been privileged to work with are the ones that have started to build the bridges over to the business. They've got personal relationships, they've got professional relationships, they understand who in the organization cares about what silos that they are necessarily responsible for. Connecting your message to an identified business driver is going to be important. And because these leaders don't have a lot of time, making sure that that information is front and center is essential. True story, I was in North Carolina a couple of years ago, having the metrics conversation with one of my customers. He said, we've got great metrics. I said, show them to me. Went into his office, he pulled a 3-inch, no exaggeration, 3-inch thick binder off of his shelf, so paper-based, put it down, and I'm not kidding you, I could actually see dust kind of flying up out of the binder. And I didn't say this to him. I said to myself, you know, is anybody actually looking at this? Or is this just an exercise that he's going through? Maybe he started, maybe his boss, his predecessor started it. You want to not have a 3-inch binder, especially when you've got that opportunity to interact with your executives. It's got to be a lot shorter than that. Pictures help, but even more important than pictures, I think I would argue, is length. A page, maybe 2 pages, if that. That might be all the attention span that those executives can spare. The other part of the partnership that I'd like to characterize between security and business is the business typically does, and I hope you'd agree with me, find it very difficult to determine or ascertain its own risk appetite. This is where we as security professionals, we aren't necessarily coming in to own the risk. The whole idea about who owns risk, I'm a big proponent of the business unit itself is the risk owner, but if no one has educated the business unit about their responsibility to own the risk, and the security professionals are really there to support the business in managing their own risk, it's tough because a lot of these guys and gals don't necessarily understand what their own appetite is. So one technique that I've certainly seen work in the past is whether you want to call it storytelling or scenario, maybe there's something that's been in the news, whether it's directly in your industry or elsewhere, those can be useful tools to try and bridge that gap. And the reality is the business unit leaders really are challenged themselves. They understand this. I had a couple of conversations last night with some of the other speakers where I was talking about an analogy about building the bridge. Security needs to get 50% over. The expectation is the business is going to meet you in the middle. The reality is that hardly ever happens. It's security's responsibility to keep walking across that bridge, maybe to the 70%, to the 80%, wherever it is, to go above and beyond because the business needs to understand why you are there and the value that you provide. So let me shift and kind of talk through a specific example. This one is a specific series of metrics starting with this number of times we were attacked last month. This was put out by Paul Proctor at Gartner. The source is on this slide as well. This is a blog post and then he later converted it into a report. This metric, the number of times we were attacked last month, is very common. I've got actually attacked in quotes, if you can see that. Very common, almost completely useless. This is probably a metric or a number that boiled up from the number of firewall drops, the AV issues, etc. So this is easy to collect, especially if you haven't taken the time to define what an attack is. It's too common. So if you have something like this in your organization, let's kind of peel back the onion and see how we can maybe start with something like this and make it a little better. Maybe I'm going to narrow that focus and focus instead on the number of unpatched vulnerabilities. Okay, well, that kind of proves that you are at least paying attention to one part of your job. That's great. Is that a useful metric? Well, you know, maybe you could kind of stretch it to talk about how much more manpower you might need to resolve that gap, but it's not really a useful metric. Maybe I want to carve it down a little finer. Maybe it's not just unpatched vulns, but it's unpatched critical vulnerabilities against critical systems. That's something that's starting to sound like it's a little more useful. It's a narrower focus. I'm probably going to only have time, at least in the beginning, to focus on those critical systems versus the less critical systems. What I don't like about this particular metric is the very first word, and it's the word number. Great, good metrics are trendable over time. So if I stop this slide right now and say this is a good metric for us to go with, let's say I've got 10 critical systems today. A year from now, I might have 25 critical systems, and the raw number that I started with has lost its relevance. So maybe instead of expressing that as a number, think about expressing that as a percentage. In this case, percentage of critical vulns against critical systems. We're getting a little closer to the ideal that I'm trying to get you to, but we're definitely not there yet, because this is still a very IT-centric, operational-centric phrase that I've got up on the slide. So thinking about how to translate this to the business, maybe I want to abstract it out a little further. How many days does it take to patch critical systems with critical updates? Most folks, at least on the business side that I've been privileged to work with, can understand that something that takes 1 day is better than something that takes 5 days. The extra credit, and the last bullet on this slide, guys, is for that security professional who has done his or her homework and crossed the bridge and understand the needs of the business. So you come up maybe with a metric like this: the number of days it takes to patch critical systems supporting the manufacturing line in Kuala Lumpur with critical patches. You probably don't have a manufacturing line in Kuala Lumpur. The point is, if you as a security professional have done your homework and you understand that Kuala Lumpur, or whatever location you choose to insert there, runs about 3 times the outage time as all of your other facilities, so there's a process, there's something wrong there, and maybe Kuala Lumpur is responsible for 40% of your organization's profit and loss. So if you've done your homework and you know that from an operational perspective, I've got one location that is disproportionately taking up a lot of maintenance, unplanned maintenance, and it's got a disproportionately large amount of P&L. Is that something you think might resonate with the business leader? This would be an example of a good metric. It's not a metric that spontaneously appears, it's a metric that requires us all as professionals to do our homework, to get to know our business peers, and to build it out so that it makes sense. This will get the right attention, because you can be sure the business leaders are focused on the P&L, profit and loss, throughout the organization as a whole. So again, Paul Proctor, these are the bullets he had in his blog post. That post is freely available. So I spent a lot of time kind of talking about bad metrics. Let's talk a little bit about, at least in my experience, some examples of good metrics. And you're going to hear me hit a couple of these points more than once. A, because I think they're important. B, because there are multiple sources that have talked about them. Typically speaking, there are 4 main high-level things that I've seen good metrics achieve. Good metrics are actionable. You can do something with the number that's been produced. Good metrics are transparent and preferably simply calculated. I certainly have some customers that want to keep that metrics, the algorithm that I use to create this metric is a black box, Mr. Business Guy. I can't share that with you, but I can share the output. You want to try and avoid that at all costs. You want to make it simple, you want to make it transparent. The more transparent it is, how you got to that number, the easier it's going to be for that audience to believe that the metric that you're providing has value and that it's actually authentic. In a perfect world, in the upper right-hand corner, there's going to be a common interpretation. People across the organization are going to understand what that number means. And then finally, the data itself, right, is accessible and creditable. It's going to be sourced from an internal or sometimes an external source that people know and trust. Again, you're staying away from the black box capability. Anybody want to guess what the last build on this slide is? It's a Venn diagram. There's 4 overlapping circles. In a perfect world, that perfect metric is going to include all 4 of these areas: actionable, common interpretation, transparent and simple, accessible, and creditable. You guys with me so far? Okay. What else makes a good metric? Andy Jaquith, kind of the godfather of security metrics, and I've got several people nodding here. I've got a great reference for you to his huge, important book, but he has really put it into one sentence here. The primary goal of metrics is to quantify data to facilitate insight. It's not just an exercise to put on a piece of paper or put into an email and send up the chain. You need to have metrics that allow you to facilitate insight. So from Jaquith's perspective, good metrics tend to be consistently measured, same each time. They are cheap to gather. Again, I'm not talking so much about cost, I'm talking about the time, and I'm talking about maybe trying to automate the process versus relying on a manual process. They're typically going to be expressed as either a cardinal number or a percentage. Remember how I talked about maybe focusing less on raw specific numbers and expressing those as percentages? Very important from a trendability over time perspective. Ideally, it's going to be expressed using at least one unit of measure. So you're not just putting the number 25 in front of your executive. You've maybe got a little text to go along with that, so they've got a little context. And it really does need, in a perfect world, to be contextually specific. One other good source I would recommend, and this is also in my summary slides. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I have some federal customers. Most of my customers are enterprise and commercial. Whenever I say the word NIST to an enterprise or commercial customer, eyes start to glaze over because people say, oh, it's a government standard. Maybe, maybe not. I need to be concerned with this. Let me highly recommend this particular NIST special publication. The 800 series, as most of us probably know, is focused on information security. NIST 800-55, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, is all around performance measurement in information security. It's all about metrics. It is a pretty good, pretty readable resource, certainly one that I'm recommending to you today. It says, 855, good metrics are quantifiable. Okay, we've kind of heard that today already. The ability to compare and trend over time. Readily obtainable, right? So something that's going to be, you can go back 3 months from now, 6 months from now, and get it again. Consistent and repeatable, some of the points, again, we've already made. Allows you to track relevant performance trends over time. And specifically points to improvement actions. This is the actionable part from the last slide. You're not just collecting numbers when you're building metrics. You want to collect those numbers to get to a point where something is actionable out of those measurements that you're taking in your organization. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the clock. We're doing fine on time. We're about halfway through. I'm about halfway through the deck, so I think that's actually a positive sign. Let's talk about, before we talk about anything, I need to hydrate for about 10 seconds. Let's talk about 5 specific metrics. I want to be very careful as I'm positioning this to you. These are not metrics that you can write down or download as part of the slides and immediately apply inside your organization, because if there's one thing, hopefully, the light bulb has already gone on for you, you understand that you can't just start with generic metrics and apply them blindly. You need to do some homework. You need to understand what's important to the business, not just what's important to security. So with that caveat, let me take you through 3 good things. I love talking about metrics with customers and with prospects because when you ask about metrics, it can shine an amazing amount of light on how well, how poorly that organization is structured and how mature / immature that organization is from an information security perspective. Just like I said a second ago, this is the Paul Proctor slide, and because this is not specific to your organization, the examples I'm going to give you are going to be kind of in this range. I got a kind of a bouncing red arrow down. It's not going to be quite at that lowest level bullet, but it's going to get you part of the way there. These are just examples to think about. Example number 1, the time that's elapsed between incident discovery and incident containment. Sounds pretty straightforward. It's actually a little more challenging. It's a lot more challenging. When I'm talking with customers and audiences, I always kind of plant the seeds to say, you know, the reason that I think this is a useful conversation point is, A, are you really equipped to measure this, or are you still kind of, I don't say this word out loud, are you still at the immature end of the scale where you're just putting out fires very reactively? That could be a great conversation starter. Do you actually have an incident management or an incident tracking system in place today? You know, maybe you do, maybe you don't. If you do, one of my common follow-up questions is, that's great that you do. Is it maybe the same incident tracking system that your help desk is using in IT? More than half the time, the answer is yes. Should they be in the same system? Maybe not. Maybe it could be a different instantiation of the same system. Maybe it could be a completely different system altogether. These are just things to think about as you move across that maturity curve. Have you actually explicitly defined what containment means? Did I contain the infection on the single machine where I think it is? What if there are 5 machines or 10 machines, or there's an entire division that's been affected? This goes back to the importance of defining your terms. I've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, looks like maybe 8 words in this metric, but each one of those words, what is an incident? What does containment really mean? You get to define it. As a security professional, you just need to define it in a way that's defensible and in a way that you have explained to your business colleagues so that they understand. Ideally, in a perfect world, you're also tracking and reporting on the root cause as part of this process. So don't just stop with the time elapsed. Think about the root cause. Sometimes that means additional investigation time, etc. This particular metric is something that my parent company, EMC, uses as one of their top 3 internal metrics that gets reported up to our executive management on a regular basis. Number 2 example, the number of orphaned information assets without an owner. I don't have a lot of customers who like to talk about asset management. It's not very sexy. It's tough. It's messy. Nobody can necessarily say we're at 100%. You got to at least walk down that path to start, to get there. Do you really know where all your information assets reside? Structured data, unstructured data, especially in an M&A, merger and acquisition context. This is one of the things that my company does. Other companies do as well when they are surveying a potential target for acquisition. One of the things we pay attention to is what are the security policies of the target company. Do they know where those information assets actually live? Because ultimately they're going to be interconnected and integrated with our own network. Might be tomorrow, might be 3 months from now. Do you actually explicitly assign owners for these assets? Some customers will say, yes, we do. Okay, so tell me a little bit more about that. How's that process actually work? Who's tracking that? Have you automated that process? Is somebody actually checking on that? When was it last done? Ben Smith was the owner of all the content on this file share, but the last time that was checked was 2 years ago. So am I still the right owner? Is somebody else the owner? Frankly, do all of your information assets need an owner? That's a great debate point. I come down squarely on the answer of yes. Sometimes it needs to be, preferably 100% of the time, it needs to be a named person. Maybe it's a team in some cases. You don't want to have any information assets that are orphaned in your environment because more often than not, that sometimes is where bad stuff can happen. And if you are at the far right end of that maturity scale and you say, yes, we've got a good handle, a good wrap around all of our information assets, we've got individuals who are the owners, how do you know if that individual is actually still on the payroll? Can you prove that? The information, again, in the example I gave you, it was correct a year ago, might not be correct today. So is there a process in place when Ben Smith terminates that someone else will be the new named administrative owner, if you will, or data custodian of that area? These are all good questions that can flow out of this one single metric. Example number 3. The days to remediate 50% or the so-called half-life of vulnerable hosts. This is an old 10-year-old metric that Qualys put out, sourced in the lower left-hand corner of this slide, and it really reflects the reality that we all live in. I don't think anybody can honestly say we're able to remediate 100% of our vulnerable hosts at all times. Maybe I can get to 90%, maybe I can get to 95%. I like this metric because it recognizes that reality. If you, like me, are going to prioritize the critical items in my environment, I'm probably going to start with the most important 50%. So maybe that's a good metric to shoot for. Yes, management's probably going to want to know about the 51st% and the 60th percent, et cetera. But Qualys went on and they've got a full paper devoted just to this one metric, believe it or not, around how to put this into place. So questions that I like to ask is, okay, you've got vulnerability capabilities, you know where they exist inside your environment. Do you factor in asset criticality at all into that? If I have 2 machines, right, and they both are showing as maybe through my vulnerability assessment, whatever tool I may have out there, that they're both equally vulnerable, do I know that this one is Ben Smith's laptop, and do I know that this one is the finance server that's in charge of generating the paychecks for my entire division? Which one of those probably should be at a higher priority? Factoring in asset criticality along with the vulnerability information that you have is essential and sometimes overlooked. Should you differentiate between internal and external systems in terms of lumping them into that 50%? Maybe your external facing systems have a different role. Maybe they're going to be treated at a different priority. Do you have an exception process? A lot of customers say, yeah, you know, we've got to live with exceptions. Do you have a process in place that allows you to track those exceptions over time? If you have a disproportionate number of exceptions, maybe there's a problem with the policy. All right? Maybe there's a problem with the policy. If you're not tracking those exceptions over time, you and your business partner might not have adequate visibility into that. Metric number 4, again, just examples for you. The number of server patches applied outside of a scheduled maintenance window. We could probably look at that and say, yeah, that would be kind of important to know. You know, I ask customers, do you actually have established maintenance windows? Sometimes I get a scary answer. It's not the right answer. If you have maintenance windows, are they consistent across server platforms? Are you upgrading your Windows infrastructure and your Linux infrastructure all within the same 2-hour window every morning between 1 and 3? Or have you maybe broken those out, not putting all of your eggs into one basket, broken those out into different windows? Maybe by operating system, maybe on some other criteria. These questions, again, in my case, are not necessarily leading to products that RSA or some other vendor can sell. It's all about getting the folks to think about how they have their current processes in place and maybe trying to think of an alternative, hopefully smarter way that's going to leave them more secure. What criteria actually determines that a patch needs to be pushed? I've got a tool that's telling me that this is vulnerable, but it's one of 150 vulnerabilities on this single device. Is there a policy in place? Asset criticality, again, is going to play into this. These are good questions that a lot of customers don't have answers to. And then finally, in this example, are you classifying and scoring those vulnerabilities in terms of prioritizing them over time? Trey, I think you've got a prioritization talk track coming up maybe tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. It's being baked as we speak. Okay, example number 5. Percentage of third-party users, this is the final example, third-party users whose privileges were reviewed this reporting period. Why is this important? Well, do you really understand your potential areas of third-party risk? We have all heard at least one, maybe multiple examples of an external vendor who had credentials for task A, and those credentials were stolen by another party and then leveraged to accomplish task B. So do you really understand those areas of risk? Do you know which of your external partners have accounts and which assets those accounts are associated with? Yep, I've got my HVAC vendor and they only have access to this part of my infrastructure. Oh, maybe that's not correct. Maybe that account has privileges that allows that account to do other things inside the infrastructure. Final bullet here, are there any assets where electronic communication to and from external vendors, including system-to-system access? So I've spent a lot of time talking about human accounts. Don't forget about system-level accounts, where that type of communication is simply not allowed. Sometimes I'll challenge customers, and they say yes. I'll say, well, yeah, prove that to me. How do you know that this set of credentials that you issued can't reach this very sensitive system internally? Again, good metrics can sometimes create some very interesting talking points internally. One more time, I'll emphasize you can't blindly apply these 5, but these are just kind of to get the juices going creatively and to hopefully start your path down there. We're in the last 10 minutes. Karen is keeping me honest here. Thank you. I appreciate it. Despite everything that I've talked about, there are really 3 big caveats or warnings that I want to leave with you. The first is, whether it's coming from RSA or any other security vendor who's got the world's greatest product to do X, Y, or Z, please do not blindly accept those metrics. Going back to what I said almost at the very top, it's very easy for us, vendors, to overvalue the things that are easy to measure, and we undervalue the stuff that we either can't measure or is tough. So if you have a vendor who says, hey, we've got this great report and it's got these 20 metrics, you'll press them. Press us a little bit on that to say, how exactly is this relevant to my environment? Well, these 3 metrics we think are very relevant. Great, let's talk about those 3 metrics and how specifically they relate to making me a more secure organization versus the so-called standard metrics that come out of the box for every customer. Good metrics are going to typically be customized for your environment because everybody is in a different line of business. Metrics should be actionable. You've heard me say this once before. This is the second and final provocative statement. It's a direct quote from a gentleman named Doug Hubbard, who is, just like Andy Jaquith, a legend on the metric side. Doug Hubbard is a legend on the measurement side, and he is one of the books I'm going to recommend to you as I close out. I am going to read the second sentence here in entirety, which says, if we can't identify a decision that could be affected by a proposed measurement and how it could change those decisions, then the measurement simply has no value. That's a pretty strong statement. Why am I measuring something? Why am I expending manpower? Why am I reporting these metrics up if they're not actionable? Maybe I shouldn't be measuring these. Maybe I should be taking my very limited time and looking at other things inside my environment. So think about the metrics that you have today. Ask yourself that question. Is this a number, either by itself or in conjunction with other numbers, something that is going to be actionable either by me or by my executive team? Third and final caveat is, let's say you've drunk the Kool-Aid over the last 45 minutes and you're going to march out of here and you're going to create the world's best metric or set of metrics. And that's awesome. I hope you do that. Let me know what that looks like in your organization when you get there. You create the metric, you love it. It makes sense, it maps cleanly to the business. It's a winner. You roll out the metric. You roll out the metric and this happens. See what's going on here? The guy on the left is convinced, oh yeah, this is a 6. The guy on the right, with the very same number, from a different perspective, says, you know what, this tells a different story. And maybe not the story that you intended the business to understand. So the moral of the story here is, spend that good work building that metric, bounce it off a peer or 2 or 3. Maybe you've got a trusted friend over on the business side as a security professional, before you roll it out and say, this is the world's greatest metric. They say, yeah, this is not telling me the story that you're telling me. It's too easy for all of us to kind of get locked in and over-focus on what we're doing and forgetting other people's perspective. This goes back to the importance of knowing your audience that we kind of started with. All right, we're in the last couple of slides. I got about 5 minutes, so we are still on track. This is the optional homework section, all right? If you are at all interested in learning a little bit more, I've got some books on this slide, starting with what I call kind of the one place to start from a foundational perspective. I've put it in italics, strategic. If you're interested in learning as much as you can about metrics, the Doug Hubbard book that I mentioned, How to Measure Anything, now in its 3rd edition, is a great resource to start. Great news is Doug Hubbard has another book coming out. It's actually supposed to be out by now. It's a few months delayed. It's coming out in the next 3 months. Its title is How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. It's an entire book from Doug Hubbard around cybersecurity risk. Mine's been on pre-order since December. I can't wait for it to arrive. If you have the time to start with the foundational reading, you can't do better than Doug Hubbard's How to Measure Anything. Most of us live in the real world, right? We don't have necessarily that time or that ability to invest in the strategic stuff. So tactically, I'm cheating here. I'm kind of giving you the Cliff's Notes version. If you can't start with the strategic, here's some tactical recommendations for reading. Starting with Andy Jaquith's book, Security Metrics. Don't be afraid. This one's a little older. It's about 8 or 9 years old at this point. It's the place to start tactically. It's around metrics, specifically in the security space. Brotby and Henson more recently published a great book called Pragmatic Security Metrics. Pragmatics in all caps there. It's 9 different letters, 9 different dimensions by which you can objectively rate whatever metric you have come up with. And then at the end of the process, let's say you have 10 metrics, each of those metrics have been scored based across this 9-dimension pragmatic model. So you know that something that's scored in a 95 is probably a pretty good metric on a 0 to 100 scale versus something that's a 40 at the end of that process. There are literally hundreds of metrics examples in this book. Highly recommended if you've got the time, or if you don't have the time, if you need to go straight to that tactical area. We didn't talk about visualization today, but I do want to throw out a big plug for Edward Tufte, who is really, for my money, the godfather of data and information visualization. He's a statistics professor at Yale, but he's very well known for his first book, The Visual Display of Quantitative Information, about 15 years old. If you are at all interested in kind of taking that next step to think about how should I present it so that it's going to be easily consumable, Tufte is a great strategic place to start. Again, if you live in the real world, like I do, maybe tactically I would recommend Greg Conte's Security Data Visualization. That is a really, really good book that is just focused on how to present security data, both to the executive and the non-executive. This particular book is out of print, but it won't take you too much work to find a used copy if you're interested. Rafi Marty has a good book called Applied Security Visualization along the same lines. I would start with the Conte book, the green one on the screen, and then if you've got the time, take a look at Marty's book as well. So if you want to get into visualization, again, for extra credit, that's what that is for. Okay, let me build out this slide. These are just some additional online resources. All of these, except for anything you see with a $sign, these are free. A couple of really good mailing lists. One, Security Metrics. Steve, you and I were talking about that just last night. Fantastic. A lot of discussions going on where I get smarter just about every day looking at that. The Society for Information Risk Analysts, or CIRA, is another good free source. I would definitely recommend you sign up for both those mailing lists if you're interested. The rest of the deck, which we're not going to go through, is 6 additional slides with even more reading if you are interested. You can see the first 2 slides here have some blue. Those are publicly accessible resources, hyperlinks that you can use. These are primarily analyst reports, which may or may not be freely available. Okay, it is exactly 1:49, Karen. How did I do? Yes, turn that around so everybody can see it. That's a good one. That's a good one. I appreciate y'all's time and attention today, and if you have any questions, since I've clearly blown my allotment, Jake, I'm going to be here the rest of today as well as at least the first half of tomorrow. Would love to talk to you. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.